There are moments in life when the world goes silent, so silent that a single breath can feel like a warning. For Sarah, that moment began the second she stepped through the daycare door and saw her son in the corner, rocking, trembling, disappearing inside himself. She didn't know the whole story yet. She didn't know about the untouched lunches, the lies whispered behind closed doors, or the danger quietly closing in around her child. All she knew was the truth only a mother can hear. Something was stealing her boy from her, and in that instant, exhaustion turned into terror, and terror into fire. Because when the system built to protect children fails them, it awakens a force far more powerful than money, rules, or reputations. A mother prepared to burn the world down to save her son. There is a unique language that exists between a mother and her child, a silent conversation spoken in glances, gestures, and the faintest shifts in energy. For Sarah, this language was the only one she shared with her 7-year-old son, Leo. And on this bleak, overcast afternoon, as the sky wept a cold, persistent drizzle, every part of that silent language was screaming that something was terribly wrong. Her body ached with the familiar fatigue of a double shift at the diner, a bone-deep weariness that had become a permanent part of her. But as she pushed open the brightly colored door of the Sunshine Sprouts daycare, a different kind of exhaustion washed over her, the heavy, suffocating weight of dread. The daycare was always unnervingly quiet when she arrived late, the forced cheerfulness of its cartoon animal murals seeming to mock the silence. Most of the other children were gone, their boisterous energy replaced by an empty echo, and there, in the far corner of the room, was Leo. He sat on the floor, his small back pressed against the wall, rocking. It was a familiar, self-soothing motion for him, but today it was different. The rhythm was faster, more frantic, a desperate beat against the quiet room. He was humming, a low, guttural sound that vibrated with distress. To anyone else, it was just a noise. To Sarah, it was a cry for help. She crossed the room, her worn-out sneakers making no sound on the rubber matting. "Leo, honey," she whispered, her voice rough with fatigue. "Mummy's here." He didn't look up, his focus locked on some invisible point in the distance. When she knelt and gently placed her hands on his shoulders to still his rocking, he flinched. A sharp, cold pang of fear shot through her. She scooped him into her arms, and her heart plummeted. He felt impossibly light, as if he were made of nothing but brittle twigs and air. His body was limp, his usual wiry strength gone, replaced by a profound exhaustion that terrified her. He rested his head against her shoulder, his distressed hum softening into a weak, sorrowful whimper. The bus ride home was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the faces of strangers. Sarah held Leo tight, her fierce, protective instincts roaring to life inside her. She was a woman forged in hardship, a single mother who fought for every scrap of stability in their precarious lives. But beneath that resilience was a constant, gnawing guilt. Was she doing enough? Was this tiny, cramped apartment, this life of juggling bills and double shifts, the best she could offer the one person who depended on her for everything? The feeling that she was failing him was a storm that never ceased inside her chest. Back in their small apartment, the air thick with the scent of rain and old building, she gently set Leo on their worn sofa. He immediately curled into a ball, his thumb finding its way to his mouth. Sarah watched him for a moment, her heart aching, before turning to his backpack. Her hands trembled slightly as she unzipped the main compartment and pulled out his lunchbox, a cheap plastic container decorated with faded superheroes. She'd gotten up at 4 in the morning to pack it, carefully cutting his sandwich into the dinosaur shapes he liked, adding the soft carrot sticks and apple slices he would sometimes eat. It was a small ritual of love, a way to send a piece of her care with him into a world he struggled to navigate. She unclipped the latches, and the smell hit her first. a sour, unpleasant odor that made her stomach turn. She lifted the lid, and her breath caught in her throat. The food was completely untouched. The sandwich was soggy and discolored, the fruit browned and soft. It was all still there, a perfect spoiled replica of the meal she had packed with such hope hours ago. This wasn't the first time. There had been other days, other untouched lunches dismissed by the daycare staff as him being a problem eater. But this was different. The limpness of his body, the desperate quality of his rocking, the sheer exhaustion in his eyes, it all coalesced into a single, horrifying truth. This wasn't just a picky eater. Her son was starving. A cold, terrifying dread, unlike anything she had ever felt, washed over her, extinguishing the warmth of her love and leaving only the icy certainty that her greatest fear had come true. A battle was coming, and in that moment, clutching the spoiled lunchbox, Sarah knew she would burn the world down to win it for her son. The fire of a mother's rage burns hotter than any star, and for Sarah it was a forge. The next morning, she didn't just wake up. She was summoned by a new, cold purpose. Sleep had been a series of nightmares, each one ending with the image of Leo's limp body in her arms. She got him ready for the day with a mechanical tenderness, her movements precise, her mind a whirlwind of strategy. She packed his lunchbox again, but this time she took a picture of it on her cracked phone screen. Then she placed yesterday's spoiled, sour-smelling meal into a plastic bag. It was her evidence, her weapon. She walked into Sunshine Sprouts daycare not as a weary, apologetic single mother, but as an inquisitor. She bypassed the young, indifferent staffer at the front desk and marched straight to the director's office. The door was slightly ajar, and through it she could see Ms. Albright on the phone, laughing at something, a perfectly manicured hand resting on a stack of pristine paperwork. The nameplate on her desk read, "Eleanor Albright, Director." Sarah knocked once, hard. Ms. Albright looked up, her smile instantly vanishing, replaced by a mask of professional concern that didn't quite reach her eyes. They were cold, calculating eyes, the kind that assessed a person's net worth in a single glance. "Sarah, is there a problem?" she asked, her voice smooth as polished glass. "Yes, there is," Sarah said, stepping into the office and closing the door behind her. The room was sterile and modern, a stark contrast to the chaotic, understaffed play areas. It smelled of expensive air freshener and ambition. Sarah placed the plastic bag on the edge of the gleaming mahogany desk. "This is Leo's lunch from yesterday. It's untouched, again. I want to know why my son is starving under your care." The director's practiced smile returned, a condescending curve of her lips. She didn't look at the bag. "Sarah, we've discussed Leo's eating habits. He can be a problem eater. It's quite common with children on the spectrum. He felt like he weighed nothing when I picked him up." Sarah's voice trembled with suppressed fury. "He was exhausted and distressed. This isn't about being picky. This is neglect." "Ms." Albright leaned back in her expensive leather chair, a picture of calm authority. Her motivation was simple, cruel, and hidden behind a veneer of corporate doublespeak. Maximizing profit. Every dollar saved on staffing or specialized care went directly into improving her own financial standing, building a personal fortune on the scraped thin resources meant for children. "That's a very serious accusation," she said, her tone dripping with false sympathy. "We pride ourselves on the investment we make in every child's well-being. Our staff is trained to encourage, but we can't force a child to eat. Perhaps something has changed at home. Sometimes instability in their home life can manifest in these behaviors." The insult was a physical blow. Sarah felt the blood rush to her face. "My home is stable. I get up at 4 every morning to make him a meal I know he likes. The only instability in his life happens in this building." The director's smile tightened. The threat came next, wrapped in the language of concern. Well, we are doing our best, but our resources are stretched. Sunshine Sprouts is a highly sought-after program. We have a long wait list of children whose needs might be less demanding. It would be a shame for Leo to lose his spot over a misunderstanding. The words hung in the air, a financial noose tightening around Sarah's neck. She needed this daycare to keep her job, the job that barely paid for their rent and food. Losing it would mean losing everything. She was trapped, defeated. She stared at the woman who held her life and her son's life in her perfectly manicured hands. Ms. Albright had all the power, all the assets, and all the answers that would protect her business. Sarah had nothing but a spoiled sandwich and a mother's terror. She left the office without another word, the plastic bag feeling heavy and useless in her hand. On the bus ride home, with Leo curled against her side, she felt a profound sense of isolation. The world was not designed for people like her. It was designed for people like Eleanor Albright. As Leo shifted, a lump in his jacket pocket pressed against her arm. Absently, she reached in, her fingers closing around a small, hard object. She pulled it out and stared at it in the palm of her hand. It was a bird, intricately carved from a single piece of light-colored wood, its wings half spread as if in mid-flight. The detail was astonishing, from the tiny feathers etched into its back to the delicate curve of its beak. She'd never seen it before. It wasn't one of Leo's toys. He preferred soft textures and bright colors. This was something else entirely. It felt old and important. In a world that had suddenly become a nightmare of cold indifference and veiled threats, this tiny wooden bird was a complete and utter mystery. She tucked the small wooden bird into the pocket of her jeans, where it rested against her thigh, a solid, tangible secret in a world that had become flimsy and uncertain. The mystery of it was a single, quiet note in the deafening symphony of her fear. But for now, it had to wait. The first week of her one-woman war was a descent into a bureaucratic hell. The fire that Ms. Albright had ignited in her had cooled into a hard, sharp-edged resolve. Sarah began to document everything with the meticulous precision of a detective building a case. Every morning, she photographed Leo's lunchbox. The vibrant colors of the food, a stark contrast to the bleakness she felt. Every evening, she photographed the same lunchbox, untouched and spoiled. She started a journal, a cheap spiral notebook where she recorded Leo's weight, his lethargy, the number of times he cried out in his sleep. Each entry was a piece of ammunition. Armed with a week's worth of photographic evidence and heartbreaking notes, she called Child Protective Services. She waited on hold for 45 minutes, listening to tinny, repetitive music, her anxiety mounting with every passing second. When a weary-sounding caseworker finally answered, Sarah poured out her story, her voice tight with the effort of holding back tears. She explained the weight loss, the untouched food, the director's dismissive attitude. The response was a bucket of ice water on her burning hope. "Ma'am, Sunshine Sprouts has a 5-star rating and a spotless record," the voice on the other end said, dripping with practiced indifference. "We have no open cases against them. Are you sure this isn't just a matter of your son being a picky eater?" Sarah insisted, offering to send her photos, her notes. The caseworker sighed audibly. "You can file a formal complaint online, but unless there are visible signs of abuse or multiple reports, it's unlikely to trigger an immediate investigation. They have glowing testimonials on file." The system, the very institution designed to be her son's shield, was instead the daycare's fortress wall. The battle on the home front was just as draining. Her boss at the diner, a man named Sal, whose patience was as thin as the coffee he served, pulled her aside after a shift. "Sarah, I like you. You're a hard worker," he began, wiping the counter with a greasy rag. "But you've been late twice this week, and you keep asking for time off. I'm running a business here, not a charity. I need people I can rely on. This is your final warning." The words were another tightening of the noose. The job was her lifeline, the meager source of the dollars she needed to keep their apartment and buy the food Leo wasn't eating. The fear of losing it was a constant metallic taste in her mouth. Feeling cornered and utterly alone, she made a devastating mistake. One afternoon, while waiting to pick up Leo, she saw another mother, Jessica, whose daughter was in Leo's class. Jessica always had a kind smile and had once commented on how sweet Leo seemed. Desperate for an ally, for someone to validate her fears, Sarah cautiously approached her. She kept her voice low, showing Jessica a picture of the untouched lunch on her phone. "Has your daughter ever come home this hungry?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding. Jessica's eyes widened with what looked like sympathy. "Oh, that's awful," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the director's office. "I've heard Ms. Albright can be difficult." Sarah, relieved, confided a little more, explaining her worries and her frustration with the system. It felt like a small crack of light in her dark, lonely tunnel. The next day, the light was brutally extinguished. When Sarah dropped Leo off, the atmosphere was glacial. Other parents, who usually gave her a polite nod, now averted their eyes, huddling together and whispering as she passed. The director, Ms. Albright, stood by the door with a look of triumphant pity. It was then that Sarah understood. Jessica, fearing repercussions, or perhaps wanting to curry favor with the director, had relayed every word. Ms. Albright had twisted her desperate plea for help into a malicious campaign, painting her as an unstable, troublemaking parent. She was no longer just a concerned mother, she was a pariah. The isolation was now complete. A thick wall of judgment and suspicion that separated her from the very community she needed. Her fight for her son had just cost her the last shred of support she had in the world. The days that followed were a blur of silent suffering. The cold shoulders at the daycare became a wall of ice, and Sarah felt their judgmental stares like physical blows. She started dropping Leo off and picking him up with her head down, avoiding eye contact, her world shrinking to the path between her car and the daycare door. The fight had been drained out of her, replaced by a hollow, gnawing dread. Leo was getting worse. His already small frame seemed to shrink further, the skin stretching tight over his delicate bones. He stopped humming altogether. The silence, more alarming than any sound of distress had ever been. He slept more, a deep, unnerving sleep that felt less like rest and more like a retreat from the world. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening. Sarah was trying to coax him to eat a few spoonfuls of soup, but he turned his head away, his eyes glassy and unfocused. Suddenly, his body went rigid. A low, guttural sound escaped his lips, and his eyes rolled back in his head. He began to tremble, a violent, uncontrollable shaking that rattled the spoon from Sarah's hand and sent it clattering to the floor. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She scooped his frail body into her arms, his name a desperate, choked cry on her lips, and ran out of the apartment, not even stopping to grab her keys or lock the door. The emergency room was a sterile, brightly lit nightmare of beeping machines and hushed, urgent voices. Sarah sat on a hard plastic chair beside Leo's gurney, holding his small, limp hand, the tiny wooden bird she'd transferred to her own pocket, feeling like a lead weight. A doctor with tired eyes and a kind but professional demeanor asked her questions that felt like tiny, sharp knives. How long has he been lethargic? What has his food and water intake been like over the past few weeks? Each question landed like an accusation, reinforcing the voice in her head that whispered she was a failure. She tried to explain about the daycare, about the untouched lunches, but her words came out in a jumbled, panicked rush that sounded like the excuses of a neglectful mother. The doctor just nodded, his expression unreadable as he wrote notes on a chart. Leo was diagnosed with severe malnutrition and dehydration. As they hooked him up to an IV, the sight of the needle piercing her son's fragile skin shattered the last of her composure. She broke down, sobbing quietly into her hands, a portrait of absolute maternal despair. It was her lowest moment, a dark abyss of failure and fear. Later, as Leo slept, the IV drip a slow, steady metronome of his survival. The doctor returned. He looked at Sarah, truly looked at her, and his professional mask softened. "It's not easy," he said, his voice gentle, "especially when you feel like you're doing it all alone." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded flyer. "This is a local support group for parents of children with special needs. They meet a few times a month. It might help." Sarah took the paper with a numb hand. It felt like a flimsy life raft tossed into the raging ocean of her life. The hospital visit cost her the last thing she had left, her job. When she called Sal the next day to explain why she'd missed her shift, his voice was flat and final. "I'm sorry, Sarah. I warned you. I have to let you go." There was no negotiation, no second chance. The financial noose had finally tightened for good. Days later, with an eviction notice taped to her door and the last of her food dwindling in the cupboards, she found the doctor's flyer crumpled in her pocket. She had nothing left to lose. That night, she walked into a drab, fluorescent-lit room in the basement of a community center. The air smelled of stale coffee and quiet desperation. A dozen other parents sat in a circle of mismatched chairs, their faces etched with the same exhaustion she saw in her own reflection. She felt like an intruder until a quiet, elderly woman with kind, wrinkled eyes and hands gnarled by a lifetime of hard work offered her a weak smile from across the room. During a break, the woman approached her. "I've seen you before," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "At the daycare. I used to be the janitor there. I'm Martha." Sarah's heart gave a painful lurch. Martha's eyes filled with tears. "I quit last month. I couldn't watch it anymore," she whispered, her voice cracking. "What they were doing to your little boy. Ignoring him, letting his food sit out all day. I saw it all. I was too scared of that woman, of Ms. Albright, to say anything. But my conscience, it won't let me sleep." Martha looked down at her hands, then back at Sarah, her gaze filled with a mixture of shame and resolve. "It was wrong. If it helps, I'll tell anyone who will listen what I saw." For the first time in a month, a flicker of something that wasn't despair ignited in Sarah's chest. It was the first real piece of leverage, a fragile, unexpected weapon delivered by a stranger's guilt. It was hope. Armed with this fragile new weapon, Sarah felt a surge of adrenaline she hadn't experienced in weeks. It was a stark contrast to the soul-crushing despair that had become her constant companion. The next morning, she met Martha at a small coffee shop, where the former janitor, her hands trembling, wrote out a detailed, signed statement of everything she had witnessed. The words on the page were a damning indictment of the daycare's neglect, a testament to the quiet cruelty that had been allowed to fester behind the cheerful facade of Sunshine Sprouts. With the statement in her purse, feeling like a soldier heading into a final, desperate battle, Sarah walked into the downtown offices of a local news station. She asked for their best investigative reporter and was eventually guided to the cluttered desk of a young, ambitious journalist named Ben Carter. He had sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to miss nothing, and he listened to her story with a growing intensity, leaning forward as she laid out her evidence on his desk, the gallery of photos on her phone, the meticulous journal of Leo's decline, and finally, Martha's signed testimony. Ben's professional skepticism melted away, replaced by the unmistakable glint of a reporter who has just stumbled upon a story that could define a career. This was more than just a disgruntled parent. This was a systemic failure, a story of corporate greed preying on the most vulnerable. This is powerful stuff, Sarah," he said, his voice low with excitement. "A single mother against a five-star institution. An eyewitness. This is exactly the kind of story we need to tell. For the first time, Sarah felt the ground beneath her feet solidify. She wasn't just a hysterical mother anymore. She was a credible source. Ben promised to start digging immediately to run a background check on Ms. Albright and the DAYCARE's parent company. He assured her that his producer would love it. As Sarah left the news station, the city sunlight felt warmer, the sounds of traffic less jarring. A powerful ally had finally joined her fight. The hope that had been a tiny flicker was now a growing flame. The flame burned brightly for exactly 48 hours. Ben called her with updates, his voice buzzing with energy. He'd found other parents who were willing to speak, albeit off the record. He'd discovered financial discrepancies in the DAYCARE's public filings. A camera crew was scheduled to interview her and Martha the following week. It seemed that the walls were finally closing in on Eleanor Albright. Sarah allowed herself to dream of justice, of a future where Leo was safe and the woman who hurt him was held accountable. Then came the phone call that extinguished everything. It was Ben, but his voice was completely different, flat, defeated, and laced with a professional fury he was struggling to contain. "Sarah, I'm so sorry. We can't run the story." "What? Why?" Sarah's stomach dropped, the world tilting on its axis. "We received a letter this morning," Ben explained, his words clipped, "from a law firm that represents Sunshine Sprouts. It's a cease and desist. They're threatening a multi-million-dollar defamation lawsuit if we so much as mention their name on air. They claim you're an unstable parent with a vendetta, and they say they have signed affidavits from other parents to prove it." Sarah sank onto her sofa, the phone feeling cold against her ear. Of course, Ms. Albright hadn't just been waiting. She'd been fortifying her position, using the very parents Sarah had once sought help from as weapons against her. The DAYCARE's vast financial resources, its capital, had been deployed not to care for children, but to hire lawyers who could crush any threat. The station's legal department, unwilling to risk a costly, protracted battle against a wealthy corporation, had killed the story instantly. Every door had been slammed shut in her face. Every path to justice was a dead end. Back in the suffocating silence of her apartment, the eviction notice on the door seemed to mock her. She had no job, no allies, and no way forward. Despair, darker and more absolute than ever before, settled over her like a shroud. She sat on the floor, leaning against the worn fabric of the sofa, her gaze empty. Leo was asleep in their shared bedroom, blissfully unaware of the war she had just so spectacularly lost. As she sat there, her fingers, moving of their own accord, closed around the small, hard shape in her pocket. The wooden bird. She pulled it out, its smooth, polished surface cool against her palm. In the dim light of the room, the intricate details seemed to stand out more than ever. It was the one object in her life that was completely disconnected from the nightmare. It held no memory of Ms. Albright, the hospital, or the eviction notice. It was just a mystery. On a desperate whim, a final, flickering impulse in the darkness of her mind, she reached for her cracked phone. She didn't even know what she was looking for. She typed in vague descriptions: intricate wooden bird carving, local wood artisan, hand-carved songbird. The search results were a meaningless flood of craft websites and hobbyist forums. It was hopeless. Just as she was about to give up, her thumb hovering over the power button, she tried one last, more specific search, describing the unique, almost signature-like way the wing feathers were etched. And then it appeared. An image, buried deep in a blog post about renowned American folk artists. It was a photograph of a bird nearly identical to the one in her hand. Her heart began to pound, a frantic, hopeful rhythm against her ribs. She clicked the link. The bird, the article explained, was the unmistakable signature work of a master craftsman named Elias Vance, a local legend who had passed away over a decade ago. He was celebrated for his unique ability to carve life into wood. His legacy, the article concluded, was now managed by his only son, a reclusive, intensely private tech billionaire known for his vast fortune and philanthropic work, Alexander Sterling. The connection was so impossibly distant, so astronomically unlikely, it felt like a dream. But it was the only thread she had left. That single thread, however, was anchored to a man who lived in a different universe. Alexander Sterling wasn't just wealthy. He was a titan of industry whose fortune was a fortress, protected by layers of assistance, security, and corporate firewalls. For days, Sarah tried to breach those walls. She called the public number for his company, Sterling Innovations, and was met with a cheerful, automated menu that led her in circles before disconnecting. She emailed every generic address she could find, info, pressy, contact her, sending desperate, heartfelt pleas that vanished into the digital ether, likely filtered as spam before a human eye ever saw them. Each attempt was a brutal reminder of the chasm that separated them. He commanded a global empire of assets and investments, a patrimony built on code and capital, while she couldn't afford her next bus fare. The eviction notice was a constant, glaring reminder that her time was running out. The landlord had given her until the end of the week. Hope began to curdle back into despair. She was a ghost in her own life, haunting the small apartment, watching Leo sleep, his face finally peaceful, untroubled by the storm raging around him. She was about to give up. The idea of reaching a man like Alexander Sterling was a fantasy, a cruel trick her desperate mind had played on her. She sat on the floor, the wooden bird in her hand, its smooth surface worn from her constant touch, ready to surrender to the inevitable. That evening, as she was scrolling through a local news feed on her phone, looking for job listings she knew she couldn't take, a small headline caught her eye. Tech billionaire Alexander Sterling to make rare public appearance. Her heart stopped. She clicked the link, her thumb trembling. Sterling, a man known for his intense privacy, was scheduled to attend a dedication ceremony the very next day. It was for a new, state-of-the-art pediatric oncology wing at the very same hospital where Leo had been treated just weeks before. It wasn't just a coincidence. It felt like the hand of fate, a staggering alignment of their worlds that could not be ignored. Scraping together the last few crumpled dollars from the bottom of her purse, she bought a bus ticket. The next afternoon, she stood across the street from the hospital's gleaming new entrance, clutching the wooden bird in her pocket. The event was a swarm of local media, elegantly dressed donors, and hospital administrators. Alexander Sterling stood at a podium, looking exactly as he did in his photos, impeccably dressed, composed, and radiating an aura of untouchable power. Sarah's worn jeans and faded t-shirt made her feel invisible and overwhelmingly out of place. She waited until the speeches were over, until Sterling was shaking hands and smiling for cameras. This was her only chance. Taking a deep breath, she crossed the street and slipped into the crowd. She pushed past people, murmuring, "Excuse me," her heart hammering against her ribs. A security guard with an earpiece moved to block her path, his expression firm. "Ma'am, this is a private event." But Sarah didn't stop. She saw an opening and darted through, her eyes locked on her target. "Mr. Sterling!" she called out, her voice cracking. He turned, his expression one of polite professional curiosity, the look of a man accustomed to being accosted. He was already preparing a practiced, dismissive smile, ready to hand her off to his aide. "Yes? Can my assistant help you?" he began, his tone polite but final. "Please," Sarah begged, her hand shaking as she pulled the wooden bird from her pocket and held it out for him to see. "You have to look at this." He was about to turn away, but his eyes fell on the small object in her palm. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The billionaire's public mask didn't just crack, it shattered. All the color drained from his face, leaving it a pale, ghostly white. His polite smile vanished, replaced by a look of raw, unguarded shock. The crowd, the cameras, the entire world seemed to melt away, leaving only the two of them and the tiny wooden bird that connected their separate tragedies. He stared at it, his breath catching in his throat, his carefully constructed emotional walls crumbling into dust. His security guard took a step forward, but Alexander raised a hand, a sharp, definitive gesture that froze the man in his tracks. He didn't take his eyes off the bird. To the confused onlookers, the reporters and donors, it was a bizarre interruption. To Alexander Sterling, it was a ghost. He took a shaky step towards Sarah, his voice a raw whisper that was meant only for her. "Where did you get this?" "My son," Sarah answered, her own voice trembling. "He's 7. He's autistic. He came home from his daycare with it." The name of the daycare hadn't even been spoken, but a look of dawning horror washed over Alexander's face. He finally looked up from the bird and met her eyes, and for the first time, she didn't see a billionaire, a titan of industry whose vast fortune was measured in stocks and global assets. She saw a father who was looking at a wound that had never healed. "My assistant will clear a room for us," he said, his voice regaining a sliver of its command, though it was now brittle with emotion. "Now." Moments later, Sarah found herself in a quiet, sterile conference room deep within the hospital. The door clicked shut, sealing them off from the world. Alexander stood by the window, his back to her, clutching the small wooden bird in his hand, so tightly his knuckles were white. The silence stretched, thick with unspoken grief. "His name was Thomas," Alexander said, his voice cracking on the name. "He was my son. He was also autistic. He loved birds." He turned to face her, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a pain so profound it was almost physical. "My father, his grandfather, carved these for him. There was a whole collection. Each one was unique." He paused, swallowing hard. "Thomas passed away 3 years ago." The confession hung in the air, a tragedy that dwarfed Sarah's own struggles. She felt a wave of empathy so strong it almost buckled her knees. "After he was gone," Alexander continued, his voice hollow, "I couldn't bear to look at his things, his toys, his books. They were a constant reminder. I donated everything to a children's charity, a bulk donation. I never asked where it went. I just wanted it gone." He looked at the bird in his hand, then back at Sarah. To think one of his most cherished possessions ended up in the hands of another little boy, at a place that was hurting him. His voice trailed off, his grief visibly transmuting into something else, something harder, colder. It was the icy rage of a man who had lost everything once and was now witnessing a cruel echo of that pain. His personal tragedy had just collided with Sarah's personal hell, and the resulting explosion was about to change everything. His motivation was no longer philanthropic. It was primal. This wasn't about charity anymore. This was about vengeance, for Leo and for the memory of Thomas. The billionaire's immense capital, the sprawling patrimony he had built and inherited, was no longer just a source of wealth. It was an arsenal. He pulled out his phone, his movements sharp and precise. "What's the name of the daycare?" he asked, his tone now devoid of all emotion except for a chilling resolve. "Sunshine Sprouts," Sarah said. He typed it into his phone, his thumb moving with terrifying speed. He made a call. "Michael," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Clear my schedule for the rest of the month. I want the entire litigation team from Sterling Innovations spun up on a new project. I'm also authorizing you to retain the top 3 private investigation firms in the country. Money is no object. I want you to dig into an entity called Sunshine Sprouts Daycare and its director, Eleanor Albright. I want to know everything. I want to see her tax returns, her personal assets, her business partners, every investment she's ever made. I want to know where every dollar of that daycare's funding has gone for the last 10 years. I want it all, and I want it yesterday." He hung up without waiting for a reply. The tables hadn't just turned, they had been flipped over and set on fire. The full weight of Alexander Sterling's fortune and influence was now a laser-focused weapon aimed directly at the heart of Ms. Albright's corrupt little empire. The investigation was not a slow unraveling. It was a demolition. Within 72 hours, the private investigators, a team of ruthless professionals who normally tracked international financial criminals, had dissected Eleanor Albright's life. They discovered she wasn't just neglectful, she was a thief. She had been systematically embezzling from the daycare for years, siphoning funds meant for staffing, supplies, and special needs resources into offshore accounts and a portfolio of high-risk cryptocurrency investments. The neglect wasn't a policy, it was a direct consequence of her greed. The underpaid, unqualified staff, the lack of resources for Leo, it was all to maximize her personal profit. As Alexander's legal team prepared a lawsuit of staggering proportions, they leaked key findings to the press. This time, there was no cease and desist letter that could stop the story. The name Alexander Sterling was a shield, and the evidence was irrefutable. The story exploded across local and national news. The narrative was irresistible, a grieving billionaire fighting for a poor, autistic boy against a corrupt daycare director. The public outcry was immediate and immense. Freed from their fear, other parents from Sunshine Sprouts began to come forward, each with their own story of dismissiveness and concern. The wall of silence Ms. Albright had so carefully constructed crumbled into dust. One evening, Sarah's phone rang. It was Jessica, the mother who had betrayed her. Her voice was choked with sobs. "I am so sorry," she wept. "I was scared of her. She threatened to kick my daughter out, but what I did was unforgivable. I read about your son. I will testify. I'll tell them everything she said. Everything she did to turn us against you. Whatever you need, I'll do it." Sarah listened, not with anger, but with a weary sense of vindication. The tide had turned. The storm she had faced alone was now a hurricane, and it was heading straight for Eleanor Albright. The fallout was immediate and catastrophic for Eleanor Albright. The carefully constructed facade of Sunshine Sprouts, polished by years of deceit, shattered in a single day. Health inspectors and child protective services, now armed with a court order and the full backing of Alexander Sterling's legal team, descended on the daycare. They found what the investigators had already uncovered: falsified records, inadequate staffing ratios, and clear evidence of systemic neglect rooted in financial malfeasance. The daycare was shut down that afternoon, its cheerful sign covered by a stark official notice of closure. Eleanor Albright's arrest was a prime-time news spectacle. She was led from her lavish suburban home in handcuffs, her face a mask of disbelief and indignation, the condescending smile finally gone, replaced by the raw panic of a cornered predator. The charges were a laundry list of her greed, embezzlement, fraud, child endangerment. Her carefully accumulated assets, the secret fortune built on the suffering of children, were frozen. The capital she had wielded like a weapon was now evidence against her. The parents she had intimidated and lied to watched the broadcast, a collective sigh of relief and justice echoing through dozens of homes. For Sarah, watching the news on her phone in the quiet of her apartment, it wasn't a moment of celebration. It was a moment of profound, weary finality. The war was over. Her son was safe, but the silence that followed was daunting. The eviction notice was still on the door. Her bank account was nearly empty. Justice had been served, but her life was still in pieces. Alexander Sterling had provided her with a temporary apartment and covered Leo's medical bills, acts of immense generosity, but she couldn't depend on his charity forever. The guilt, that old familiar ghost, began to creep back in. She had won, but at what cost? She was a hero to strangers, but she was still an unemployed single mother with an uncertain future. A week later, an invitation arrived. It was from Alexander Sterling's office, a formal request for her to attend a press conference. She was hesitant. The glare of the media spotlight was something she had never wanted. But the invitation was personal, and she felt a duty to the man who had become her unlikely champion. She found a simple, clean dress at a thrift store and took the bus downtown to the Sterling Innovations Tower, a gleaming monument of glass and steel that pierced the city skyline. She was escorted to a seat in the front row of a packed auditorium. The air buzzed with the energy of a major media event. Alexander Sterling walked onto the stage, not with the pained grief she had seen in the hospital, but with a new, powerful resolve in his eyes. He stood at the podium, a portrait of quiet authority. "A few weeks ago," he began, his voice echoing through the silent room, "my life was intersected by the story of a mother and her son, a story of neglect, of a system that failed them, and of a mother's refusal to be silenced." He looked directly at Sarah, a flicker of shared understanding passing between them. "This ordeal has revealed a profound failure in our community's duty to protect its most vulnerable children. It has also shown me that my own private grief has kept me on the sidelines for too long." He paused, the cameras flashing. "My foundation's investment strategy has, until now, focused on technology and global health. We have generated incredible profits, seen our assets grow, and managed a portfolio of stocks and bonds that has built a significant fortune. But what is the purpose of such a vast patrimony if it cannot protect a single child from starving in the city where it was built?" The question hung in the air, a stunning indictment from a man who was the very embodiment of capital. "Therefore," he announced, his voice ringing with conviction, "I am announcing a fundamental shift. My foundation will be liquidating a significant portion of its current holdings to fund a new, singular mission. In memory of my son, Thomas, and in honor of the courage of Sarah and her son, Leo, we will be building the Thomas Sterling Early Intervention Center." A wave of murmurs and clicks from the cameras filled the room. Alexander raised a hand for silence. "This will not be just another daycare. It will be a state-of-the-art, non-profit sanctuary for children with special needs. It will have the best therapists, the best educators, and a one-to-one staff ratio. It will be a place of safety, learning, and support, and its services will be offered on a sliding scale, making them accessible to every family, regardless of their income. It will be a place where no parent ever has to choose between their job and their child's well-being again." He then revealed the final, transformative piece of his plan. An institution like this needs more than just funding. It needs a heart. It needs leaders who understand the fight these parents face every single day. That is why I have asked Sarah to accept a leadership position at the new center. He looked at her again, his expression serious but kind. "She will be the Director of Parent Advocacy and Community Outreach. Her experience, her resilience, and her unwavering dedication are the exact qualities this center will be built upon." Sarah stared at him, her heart stopping in her chest. The sounds of the room faded away. A job, not just a job, but a purpose, a chance to turn her pain, her struggle, and her harrowing journey into a shield for other families. Tears welled in her eyes, but for the first time in months, they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming, impossible hope. Her suffering had not been for nothing. It had been forged into a new beginning, not just for her and Leo, but for countless others she hadn't even met yet. The world had tried to break her, but in the end, she had simply bent it toward the light. The press conference ended in a storm of applause and flashing cameras, But for Sarah, the world had gone quiet. She sat frozen in her seat, Alexander's words echoing in her mind. Director of Parent Advocacy, a leadership position, a purpose. It was more than she had ever allowed herself to dream of. The path she had walked through hell had not led to a dead end, but to a foundation upon which something beautiful could be built. Months later, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue. Sarah stood on a patch of freshly turned earth, a gentle breeze rustling the architectural plans on a nearby easel. The site of the future Thomas Sterling Early Intervention Center was buzzing with quiet, hopeful energy. She was no longer the weary, defeated woman who had counted her last few dollars for bus fare. She stood tall, a new confidence in her posture, her eyes clear and focused. Alexander Sterling stood beside her, not as a reclusive billionaire, but as a partner. The shared grief over their sons had forged an unbreakable bond between them, a quiet understanding that needed no words. He had found a way to channel his immense fortune, the vast assets and capital he commanded, into a legacy of healing. And between them, holding his mother's hand, was Leo. He was no longer the limp, lethargic child from the emergency room. With proper nutrition, therapy, and most importantly, the security of his mother's unwavering presence, he was beginning to blossom. He held a small, colorful pinwheel, watching its blades spin in the wind, a soft, contented hum rising from his chest, the sound Sarah had feared she would never hear again. As the ceremony began and Alexander spoke of new beginnings, Sarah felt a gentle tug on her hand. She looked down. Leo was looking up at her. His eyes, usually distant, were now clear and present. He wasn't looking at the crowd or the pinwheel. He was looking directly at her. And then it happened. A slow, beautiful curve of his lips, growing into a smile so rare and so brilliant it felt like the sun breaking through the darkest storm clouds. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated happiness, a smile of safety, a smile that said everything his words could not. It was her victory, her reward, the culmination of every tear she had shed and every battle she had fought. In that single, perfect moment, all the pain of the past month, the lost job, the eviction notice, the crushing loneliness, it all found its meaning. She had lost the small, fragile life she had been fighting to hold together, but in its place, she had built a fortress of hope for countless others. Her personal sacrifice had become a communal triumph. She squeezed her son's hand, her own smile matching his, and looked out at the future being built before them, a future she had earned not with money or power, but with the unstoppable force of a mother's love. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by liking this video and subscribing to the channel. And we'd love to hear from you. Share your thoughts in the comments below. Thank you for watching.